I'm Jonah Comstock, Editor-in-Chief of Pharma Forum. I'm here with Mindy McGrath, a Senior Executive and Health Industry Advisor at Vynamic,
Yes,
which is an Inizio company.
that's correct.
So tell me a little bit, before we get started, we're going to talk about the IRA, right?
We are going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, yes.
But before we get into it, tell me a little bit about Vynamic. What do you guys do, and what brings you here to Philly?
Yeah. So we are health industry management consultants. We work across life sciences, providers, health services, and health tech. And we are really passionate about shaping the future of health. So a lot of our work and experience has meant partnering with these types of clients, helping them transfer strategy into action.
So if there's anything I've heard more about today than AI, it's the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm a little surprised, actually, because, last year we were talking about it a lot because it was brand new and everyone was sort of up in arms. Obviously, it's still pretty new and only some provisions have gone into effect,
Right.
But we have a much better view of what it actually is and what the effects actually are than we did a year ago. So from your perspective, the 10,000-foot view, what are we looking at with the Inflation Reduction Act? What is the effect that it's having on pharma R&D and pipelines?
So I would say, I think you're right. Last year, there was a lot of apprehension about the Inflation Reduction Act. We've now had a little bit of period of time to come up for air, right, as an industry, to also see some guidance coming out from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that's more directed towards the payers and their provisions. But I do think, pharma companies are doing what they do best, right, which is starting to take stock of the legislation with the realization that there's a long tail to this. The provisions kind of roll out over a period of time. And so now's the time to start really assessing what we know to this point. There's still a lot of uncertainty with this legislation and how it actually plays out. And probably the most uncertainty is around what the payer response is going to be, which could really be a major indicator, right, of where life sciences and pharma companies need to go.
What do you mean by the pay response? Is that like private payers? Are they going to follow Medicare? Or?
Right. So payers that actually offer Medicare Part D to their members, which is the first part that is being redesigned as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, have quite a few mandates that they have to adhere to starting, this year. Obviously, they already had to offer a $35 cap on insulin, and they had to offer vaccines, right, to be free of charge to their members. Next year, they're really responsible for redesigning Medicare Part D, which is a major coverage element for life sciences, we call it life sciences, sorry, for pharmaceutical clients. So I think, what pharma needs to understand as part of getting this response right is understanding what these payers are actually going to do and how they're going to manage their formularies in light of some of the additional responsibilities, financial responsibilities that they take on as a result of the IRA.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure the payers themselves don't really know how they're going to respond to this yet either.
Right. No, I think so CMS has issued some guidance that helps them understand what part of the requirements are when it comes to the smoothing provision that will enable their members to be able to pay for their therapies out of pocket over a planned year, so it smooths what their out-of-pocket liability would be. They also have much better clarity now on what the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap will be as well, and what they have to take on as part of the catastrophic coverage. So I think payers may be a little bit more ahead of the game right now, just because their requirements are going into action at the end of this year. Where I think members will, have not felt the effects yet is obviously with the price negotiations on the 10 drugs that were identified earlier in 2023. That doesn't come to fruition for them until 2026. So they're really not going to feel the effects of that. And even so, may not feel the effects right away.
But we are seeing the effects when it comes to planning and pipelines, right? They're deciding what they're going to be investing in for the future that is after 2026, and they're maybe thinking small molecules are not as good a bet as they used to be. Are we seeing that? Or is that a little overblown in the rhetoric?
No, I don't think it's rhetoric. I think it's part of the process. And I do think the first stage in all of this was taking stock of what you already have in advanced stage pipelines to determine how are you going to sequence indications? What kind of data package do you need to perhaps, anticipate what will go on with these negotiations. Then I think you back into what's in your earlier stage pipeline and what do you do differently? Do you start to think about where your prioritization may lie in terms of therapies that may not have as much exposure to Medicare? Do you start to think about stacking versus sequencing indications? I think at the end of the day, when it comes to these pipelines, the name of the game for a lot of life sciences clients is going to be speed. They're going to have to get these products to market quickly, once again, because we don't really know how payers are going to behave with their formulary management. And, if you're a life sciences client, you want to get your products out to the market as quick as you can, right? With as good of a value story as you can possibly have.
So one thing I've heard a lot is that when the government comes in and says that a company can't make money one way, one of the unintended effects is they will find a way to make that money some other way. So they will raise the price on something that they are allowed to raise price on in the case of pharma. And I wonder if that's also true of the payers, who are exposed to additional liability in Part D, who have a cap on out-of-pocket costs. I mean, are there going to be unintended effects with prices going up elsewhere to try to maintain those bottom lines?
That's a really good question. I think with any sort of legislation that you see, there's always going to be some unintended consequence. I mean, obviously the concern is you're focusing very specifically with this legislation on a government market in Medicare. So the question then becomes, will there be spillover into the commercial markets, both from a payer side as well as from a pharmaceutical side? Because they have to find those monies, right, to make up for where the losses may be in the Medicare market.
Yeah. And I mean, if your objective is to lower prices, then it is kind of an interesting question. Like, when you step back and look at the whole landscape, like, where is that money going?
Well, yeah, so some of the money that's been obviously stripped or will be stripped out in terms of negotiating on drug prices and even like health plans absorbing more of the catastrophic coverage. I mean, some of those savings that have been touted specifically in the drug negotiation is meant to then go, into financing the marketplace, which it's really a transfer of money within the system. It's not really an extraction of money totally out of the health system. And I think that's how, when we think about the Inflation Reduction Act and all of those provisions, and you really start to map them out, you realize that they're using it as a financing vehicle for other parts of government-run programs.
So my last question is a big question that I'm asking everyone I talk to who's in your particular area, which is about how do you solve the big problem of drug prices? What kind of systemic changes need to happen in order for drugs to be more affordable globally for patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think our system here in the United States is a very complex system. There are many players within the system, or like intermediaries, if you will. And one thing we're not doing enough of is really talking about the role of the pharmacy benefit manager and the PBM and that rebating model that seems very opaque to many in the industry. I don't think we've had a really good national conversation on what the intention is, right, of pricing in the United States, and really understanding the value. I mean, there is so much value in pharmaceuticals, and yet I don't think as an industry we've done a great job of really articulating and positioning that correctly, and as a result, it becomes part of the headline news on a regular basis. And headline news can be really dangerous because underneath of all of that, there is a level of complexity that in many ways doesn't reside with pharmaceutical companies. It really resides with the intermediaries that play a role in the US healthcare system.
Yeah.
So when you ask me, like, how do you solve that? I'm not big on legislating all over the place, but I do think at some point we need to have a very robust conversation about how payment actually occurs through the system and what types of incentives exist, and candidly, transparency. I mean, there are just too many areas in the healthcare system that are not transparent enough, so nobody can really make good decisions on, how do you actually get to the root cause of this issue.
That value framing really cuts both ways, because you can ask, what is the value pharma provides, and has the public been made aware of that sufficiently? But also, what value exactly are the PBMs providing? And is it commensurate to the amount of money they're extracting from the system? So it's tough.
It is it is tough, and they are meant to represent health plans and employers, and they would tell you that they save money and that most of what they're extracting from the system goes back to an employer. And the question is, does it go back to an individual? And a lot of times it does not. But I think back to your point, and like it's tough because I don't think the public generally understands how much investment goes into actually developing and discovering candidates that could actually make it to market as a drug. And that story, I think we've tried to tell it as an industry a couple of times, but maybe it just doesn't resonate. I think I find personally people are always shocked when I tell them how much investment is made in trying to bring a drug to market, and that it's not solely commercialization. It's the R&D piece of it. It's the fact that there's high fail rates.
Yeah.
That there's just, I don't think the general sentiment would be there's not a lot of public appreciation for that level of risk that's taken on through, a decade and a half of research that's done.
Or for the results, frankly.
Or for the results,
I think we see more headlines about how a new cell therapy costs $4 million a pop than about how incredible these cell therapies are.
Yeah.
They're both stories, don't get me wrong.
Both stories, right? and the thing is, like, you think about what is that drug actually, or therapy, what's the benefit of that? Well, if it reduces overall health utilization and it reduces hospitalizations, which are extremely expensive, especially for somebody that has a chronic condition where it may be repeat hospitalizations on a regular basis. I mean, it's like the economics start to actually tell the tale about why there's so much value in a therapy like that. So I just think it's a very sophisticated story, and it's difficult sometimes to get it through in like a very concise manner.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Wandered far afield, but
Yes.
It's all really interesting stuff and I think really important stuff.
No problem.
Thanks
Pleasure.
so much.
Thanks.